most obvious thing is just the communication coordination as you scale up.
Today, I'm talking with David Lim, Director of Design at Cultute.
The old practices, like when you're consulting, you'd have an entire engagement which would just be developing like a service blueprint or a journey map or something. And now we still want those artifacts, but we don't want to spend 2 months putting them together and doing the research.
He joined when the company was 20 people and helped scale design practices as Cultute grew to 1,000, moving from engineer-led shipping to product and design maturity.
Maybe the balance that you need changes over time depending on the need for the business and the particular situation and things like that.
He's led design through hypergrowth, navigating sales, versus retention trade-offs, and the messy reality of design systems at scale. Dave, thanks for jumping on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Most startups start with just building stuff. They think they've got a problem. They start building stuff and it's engineers that come in first. Was that the case when you joined Cultute? Obviously, there was someone doing part-time design before you, but like, were you kind of coming into something that was already pre-built and as a designer coming in a little bit late going, all right, now we need to look over this. What else can we do? How can we fix this? Or how can I help you make change?
Yeah, it's a funny situation. I mean, it's become a lot more common now for designers to be part of the or at least design as a discipline, be part of the founding sort of group. I think less so then. It was much more engineering driven. And so sort of coming in, Dan was a really great sort of like, he had a small agency with a friend and had done a lot of refinement, but a lot of the original work had been just like sort of like built out of Bootstrap. There'd been a lot of sort of difficult to update customization and things like that based on sort of initial branding that had been done. And so it was a bit of a interesting sort of ecosystem to drop into where we didn't really have a system per se to build from. And Dan was pretty sort of like innovative, so he was always sort of exploring new options, things like that, which sort of brought its own sort of challenges. We ended up kind of like sort of like naturally skewing towards different parts of the platform at the time. Back then, Cultute was largely sort of aimed at a more expert user base, and there was a lot of mostly just sassifying the engagement reporting and terming. So since then, it's obviously grown to a much broader sort of product base. But at the time, we sort of split towards the reporting and the administration and user flows and things like that. But there was a lot of prior art. And back then, the way the teams were structured and the way that process worked, sort of founders were kind of like prioritizing backlogs and functionality. And so there wasn't like a design process like we sort of think as one now. So often Dan and I, by the time we were seeing stuff, at least to start with, a lot of stuff had been built and we were just kind of like fixing the front end. And then increasingly over time, we started to get it ended up being more and more ahead of the builds, more sort of discussing getting back more towards like the problems that were sort of underlying the functionality and things like that. But yeah, by then there's enough sort of like prior work that it can be tricky to kind of normalize again.
Just coming into like an engineer-led team, was there resistance? Because we're talking about like it was 10 more years ago, 13 years ago. Design wasn't as big as it is today, so people didn't understand it as much. Going into an engineer-led team, working closely with the founders or the co-founders, was there quite a lot of understanding of design? Were they open to it, or was it kind of a little bit of had to sell design into it and sort of take them on that journey that design is actually going to play a pivotal role in building the product?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been like a strong sensibility amongst the founders. Didier really cares about it a lot. And I've worked with Rob before. Everyone was sort of behind the general concept, but it wasn't like an established sort of and well understood practice, at least at the time. So like kind of understanding where it was valuable was part of the journey, I think. So it wasn't just about designing UI, but sort of like getting into that overlap with the product side of things, understanding the underlying problems and feeding into things like prioritization and things like that. And sort of building the perceived value of things like discovery and that kind of like de-risking. It's practices that everyone had sort of been doing, but like it's tricky because when it's a B2B is a little bit different to a consumer, and the founders had been working with customers and buyers. And in B2B, the customers and the users are frequently not the same people, or if customers are users, they're a very small proportion compared to like the general employees who use the platform. And so a lot of the product thinking is driven by those customer conversations. So it's driven by sort of like the needs of admins in the platform, perhaps more so than individual users and things like that. So starting to kind of tease that nuance apart a bit is, I suppose, something that we sort of came into fairly early.
Yeah. Going back to obviously joining in, and I guess the company kind of took off, right? So do you remember any of like the biggest frustrations for you as a designer joining a company that had such rapid growth? Like that, like I remember when they started, they just were hiring insanely quick. How does that shape what you do as a designer, and how quickly you have to move? Like, what were some of the frustrations or tricky scenarios that came up?
I mean, there's kind of constant growing pains to some degree, but I think maybe like the most obvious thing is just the communication coordination as you scale up. Like, it's relatively easy to keep things like both your thinking and your actual outputs fairly consistent when there's less people involved. You know, you have perfect consistency with a single designer who's also building, and then as you add more people, you have to add more communication and more coordination and more alignment, and that gets harder. And so I think there's also like an organizational sweet spot, like when you get somewhere between, I don't know, 80 to 100 or so people, where it becomes like functionally almost impossible for everyone to be across everything. And sort of that's like an interesting transition as well. The sort of trade-off challenges for designers, I think, come in around, I guess, the idea that like for a fast growth startup, speed to market's like the highest priority above everything else. And if you lay the B2B on top of that, you've got this kind of like tension between speed to market, needs of the buyers, and then the traditional design focus, which is very much on end user usability. And it's not as clear a well-defined line between the two, or often isn't. And so it can be hard to prioritize work for experience, even over just basic functionality that people are asking for. Oh God, it gets complicated because then you start bringing in things like the tension between sales and retention. So getting new customers in, like the sales process, it's not a consumer. So people aren't just like putting down their credit card, giving it a try for a month and giving up. It's a huge procurement sort of process that it all has to go through, legals, have to sign contracts. And so there's a lot of due diligence done in advance. A lot of the sales process basically involves like being able to sort of tick off certain boxes in RFCs, and it's based more around perception of the product and what it does, even over actual usage. And then, you know, your contract comes around in a year, you move on to renewals, and suddenly the actual way it works and the experience of using it becomes a much bigger factor. And so you've got a tension there between like a really sort of like feature driven, so the sales stuff tends to be quite feature driven, and then towards like retention, where you have to be thinking more about the underlying goals they're trying to achieve and the experience that they're doing it. And so that can be a really tricky thing to navigate as well.
How did you get that balance right? Because like obviously in a scale up, sales is always going to be a huge driver, right? You want to move as quickly as possible. You need to get users to prove that you can get, in this case, obviously funding to be able to like people to want the product. But then you've got to focus on having a good experience so people actually stay with the product. Like how do you get that balance right as a designer, being able to prioritize which one to spend more time on?
I'm not sure you ever really do get it quite right. And I think maybe the balance that you need changes over time depending on the need for the business and the particular situation and things like that. So at certain stages, you just really have to prioritize certain business outcomes potentially. And then like just the underlying experience kind of sits underneath everything, but it's really easy to make small compromises along the way without ultimately understanding how they sort of like ladder up to a much bigger problem, whether it's like technical or design debt or perception of the usability of the product overall. And once you've got that kind of like cumulative effect of lots of small things, it's a really hard thing to unwind because it's not a specific thing. like if something's broken, you can fix it, and then you can tell a customer, look, we fixed it. But if it's like this feels hard to use, it's both a hard thing to respond to and a hard thing to change someone's perception on afterwards. So I guess, yeah, that's part of that balance, is like trying to have an eye to the future and sell that kind of like potential future costs against the current needs, which is really tricky. I think it's a muscle you kind of learn to use and get better at. And so I think we've learned to do it better over time. We've had some success like with things like creating user profiles using frameworks like jobs, pains, gains, things like that. So the big part of that is like being able to be at least aware that there's the different users involved in the process, and they have different wants and needs, and they impact our sort of like business needs differently as well. And so being able to, like, even if you can't always resolve it cleanly, being able to acknowledge that that's the case, and then look for nice areas where you can find, or opportunities where you can find overlap, or I'm trying to think of a better word than synergy, but I can't. But like opportunities that sort of line up through them. Like I guess an example of that might be we use adoption a lot. So for like intrinsic processes in an app, like, I don't know, development planning or something like that. People's involvement, like people's adoption is the first proxy that admins or HR people in the business have that rollout of a program's been successful. Like, are people using it? And so you can use that as kind of a lever to sort of factor in the experience of using it, task completion, and things that are more related to usability. So you sort of come at it sideways.
Okay. How, like, obviously you're talking about designing for two different subsets, so B2B and B2C. How do you differentiate the return on investment for design when you're doing maybe B2B, which is a longer sales cycle? Do you say more admin focused? Like, how do you I guess prove the value in each different scenario?
It's really hard, I think. I think B2B, like, there's a reason why you don't see a lot of B2B examples. Well, probably confidentiality, but you don't see them at design conferences and stuff because they're complex, and it's often you're making different sort of trade-offs, I think. Like I was sort of saying, the part of it is like finding ways to connect. The challenge is finding a way to connect an experience outcome for an end user back ultimately through the customer experience and the customer's kind of like outcomes they're trying to achieve back to your business outcomes. And you can do that directly with the customer because the direct signal is like sales, it's just money. But then you have to understand that bit in the middle and find those connections. And I mean, there's ways to do it, but often, like I was sort of saying, by the time a signal from end users bubbles up, it can be too late to make an easy change. Like, it's better to try and get ahead of that by learning that, by getting that feedback and reacting to it early rather than sort of having to respond to it later. But it's hard. Like, it's completely fair that like you've only got a finite amount of capacity, and you need to be always making a call on where you're putting that at a particular point in time. Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things where I think it's easy to look back in retrospect at things you would do differently now, but at the time, the otherwise it's so obvious.
I'm interested because it's one of the biggest challenges for a designer. Like, when you become a designer, you're not thinking about like business metrics and what the impact's going to be back to the business from a revenue perspective. Do you think joining such a fast growing startup, you kind of had to learn this earlier on in your journey as a designer? Did you have to really understand, okay, how is what I do driving sales or helping drive sales forward?
Yeah, I think so. There's probably a couple aspects to that. One is like generalization versus specialization. So startups, when they're smaller, tend to skew towards more generalist employees because you've got more flexibility in how they can be deployed, and they can fill gaps and cross multiple things. So especially when it all was fairly young and you don't have a lot of good coverage with, cross-functional teams with product managers and things like that. And so as they grow, like, and things get more organized, you tend to specialize more. So you get that kind of like, I guess, curve of change there. But the way we work, we've always sort of worked in a team of teams-esque kind of model. And so you have these smaller cross-functional teams that sort of have their own accountabilities and stuff. what that kind of does is give you opportunity to work in a really embedded way with the cross-functional leaders that you don't if you know like a hub and spoke model. Yeah, you build the context with the same team of people. You can build the relationships and the ways of work, and through that you both learn about the sort of like delivery and feasibility aspects, and you've learned and develop your business acumen and that customer side of things, and then through that you build trust and you're able to influence the different parts of the process. I think in a way that's hard to do when you're in a more centralized model because the interactions are much more, I don't know, transactional or sort of over the fence.
How have you, obviously you've been with Cultute for such a long time, but like, how have you seen that change? Like you talked about communication when it was less than 80 to 100 people was a lot easier. Everyone could kind of see what was happening. Now being at 1,000, like what are the differences you've seen in that, where back then you had to be a generalist, you had to understand the business acumen side of things, you had to be involved in a lot more than you would be now? Like how has your role changed from the scale up side of things to now that it's obviously a bit more of a different size beast? Has your role become a lot more specialist, a lot more defined? Like, are you still utilizing the skills that you learned along the journey?
It's a funny one. So I think you've got that. Yeah, you kind of like, it's like sitting on the surface of a balloon as it's growing. Like there's the aspect of your own growth and there's the aspect of the needs of the business that changes around that. So I think, yes, there was definitely a stage I went through where I started moving more from generalization towards specialization, like as the moved more and more away from any sort of implementation work as the engineering changed, but there was more sort of like formalization built into the practices and processes. We started getting into more complex sort of technologies I wasn't familiar with. I didn't have the time and capacity to keep up with change. So start to skill in the areas where you can add the most value over the area being more generalized. We start to see the opportunities in getting specialized researchers and content people and stuff like that involved in the process. I think there's been, I would expected that was the general trajectory, but I think things have changed a bit over the last, 5 years or so. And some of that was like, I think a result of COVID and the, that kind of like, I don't know, sort of like change in the industry when interest rates went up and capital got more expensive, and suddenly we were trying to start thinking about making do with a bit less. And so suddenly generalization was seen as more of an advantage because you didn't need, like, when you're trying to get by with less people, you want people who can do more things, which is like the way you do it in the first place with a small startup, I guess. And then I guess you now got AI as well. And so this idea that there's these kinds of like multipliers that can be used to enable people in otherwise gaps to be more sort of multifunctional. I think that's still, like, I think that's the vibe. I'm not sure. I've seen a lot of good and like mixed stuff in practice, I think, but I feel like the trajectory is back more towards people who can cover a slightly broader area.
100% it is. Like you hit the nail on the head. It's weird having the discussion about the financial system with the designer, but yeah, exactly. When capital got more expensive, when interest rates went up, money was harder to get. So if you're a company trying to scale, you're not going to be scaling as fast because it's harder to get money. But like it actually impacted enterprise just as bad. So people are spending less money, they're not making as much money. And what's happened is, and it's still happening, to be honest, is people are cutting the size of their teams and just asking designers in this scenario to do more with less. So it doesn't mean the workload's gone. It just means you're expected to have a higher output. And I think AI has been like this. It's still a bit of a buzzword, right? AI, everyone thinks that it's going to make everyone way more efficient and way more effective. But like, there's still gaps in that. Like, I think it's really helpful when it comes to like research, and it can speed up certain areas of research. But like when most designers aren't trained properly on AI yet, or how to use AI. So for expecting them to do research, like if you're a product designer, expecting a designer to do research the same as a research designer is never going to happen. Yeah, you might have a tool, but you're not going to have the the understanding and the skill level to be able to direct that tool to get the output that an actual dedicated researcher would. So like everyone is a generalist right now. We're back to that. So like you're not called a UX designer, you're called a product designer, and a product designer is expected to do research and a bit of service design and everything in the middle.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And like the old practices, like when you're consulting, you'd go through a process, like you'd have an entire engagement, which would just be developing like a service blueprint or a journey map or something. And now we still want those artifacts, but we don't want to spend 2 months putting them together and doing the research. So we get more sort of pragmatic, I guess, in the way we sort of come at these things. I think you're right. The challenging thing I think about AI proficiency is like everyone's trying to build it, which is, I think, the right thing to do in the current environment. We've all got more to do, anything we can do. But so from there's a productivity and a capability perspective to that. But it's a really open-ended kind of tool. It's not like when we moved from Photoshop to Sketch to Figma, and it's like, you're doing the same kinds of general things in different ways. Or you're letting your programming language or something like that. But AI is so open-ended. I don't think we have a really good handle on what's good and what practices are good and bad. Like what's the right way to use it, and when is it a good usage and when has it been a bad one? And we only really judge by the outcomes, which is like not a great way to learn because you can put a lot of effort into something that isn't ultimately very useful. Like prototyping, like it can be, depending on what you're doing, it can be quite easy to pull together something functional that feels really valuable and quick, and it can be really useful in certain circumstances, but it can be quite hard to refine something in a really particular way. And like there's a lot of discussion, I guess, at the moment around, I mean, there was a bunch earlier on. I think there was some like provocational pieces around product managers no longer existing, or there's always ones about designers no longer existing. You get this like multifunctional unicorn with an AI on one side who does everything. But I don't think that's quite right. But yeah, it's not like you can just give someone a course and say, here's the best practice for producing prototypes. It's very contextual. It's very how you can respond to what the AI does. I've done a few things where I need to make a relatively small change, and the AI has just changed something backwards and forwards 3 times, telling me what a great idea it was each time. And when you get stuck in that can be quite tricky, So, and I guess so that's where I was going with that was the, so when you're sort of cutting our roles, the idea is we're starting to think about, designers used to be a lot more sort of like crossover with front-end engineers, I guess. And so it's like kind of, can designers actually, by designing with AI to sort of bridge some of that gap, can they also be shortening some of the development process by producing that or being able to make like experience changes and things like that? And like it'd be really cool if we can, but I still don't think we've like solidly worked that out yet. Like we're not confident that the stuff we can produce that way is good enough, or will be good enough to be able to be actually used directly in production like that. Especially when you've got like really sort of like liabilities around it having issues for like, especially with enterprise customers.
I agree. I think it's an amazing efficiency gain tool, but I don't think it's where it needs to be wiping out developers and designers left, right, and center. I think they're still very needed because like they're highly skilled. And like, to be honest, I love AI. I use it for everything, but it still can't beat me in certain things. Like it can help me get there faster, but I still need to be able to look over it, review it, make changes, and then have my human input. I just can't get that output at all in certain things. So it's not where it needs to be yet, but it's helpful. Anyway, let's move on from AI because I feel like I talk about it way too often. Let's jump on to design systems. At what point in the journey of scaling up did you guys implement a design system?
So in the early days, we had the founders, in order to sort of get started, had built out of Bootstrap, which was the main, easy to use UI kit / design system at the time. It had been heavily customized, so it was like customization was kind of built into the practice. And I think at that stage of my life and career, we kind of looked at design systems as more of a constraint or a straitjacket than like an accelerator, which is just, I think, about my maturity as much as anything else. So like there was resistance in the beginning.
Did I ask a question on that?
Yeah.
Do you still think like if you go into like a startup, right, like they are still facing that problem of trying to get market fit and grow faster. Do you still think that they are looking at design systems like a bit of a roadblock or something that's slowing them down as opposed to saving them money and making them move faster?
I don't know. I mean, it comes down again to that thing where it's like, where are you putting your effort? And I suppose this will come up when we talk more about design systems, but like you want to be putting your effort into the problems that are hard to solve, that are contextual to your product and your business and your customers, not things like how a multi-selection work or how do you make this accessible in the right way. I think the really huge advantage to design systems, and particularly ones where they're fairly well established, is that you've got like really good defaults from the start. And that can kind of inherently lean you a little bit towards a certain level of, I guess, consistency and coherence, because you're kind of like building from a particular set of Lego, I guess. And so the stuff you make is going to feel similar, even if you don't have really good guidelines around how it's composed and things like that. Yeah, I don't know. I think there was as well at the time. I think there was a real sort of, when there was like a real sort of boom in startups, and there was a real trend to, like, design was really on the ascendancy, and there was a real, I guess, a dribble. There was like a real towards like really overwrought kind of like highly like really skeuomorphic kind of like interaction design, and it was really cool. But like your products, especially in a startup, like you're pivoting constantly, you're changing your system. You need to be able to adapt to the change, and in a way that isn't just going to like create future debt for yourself. And like, it's hard to do, but while you're learning, I don't think you should be putting that much effort into trying to smooth, like build a perfectly bespoke experience around something that's likely to change significantly. So it's, I guess it's a hard trade-off to make. But if you're in like trying to learn quickly, maybe that's where you want to have really, like I said, really good, sensible defaults to start with, and then you can start thinking more about that kind of like context-specific ecosystems where things stabilize.
Can we talk about the evolution then? Because you're saying maybe not get it right as you grow, because everything's going to change, and it's going to change very quickly. The product might completely change if, I don't know, something happens. Let's talk about the evolution of your design system. Like where did you start, and what was the bare minimum that you thought would kind of work across multiple product teams to keep the consistency? And then how did that evolve over time to what it is today potentially?
I think I wouldn't necessarily use the way we came at it as like an example for the future. Like we were sort of learning as we went. It was actually the third product designer we hired, Mark, who was really passionate about sort of delivering a design system, but he'd owned an agency, and he'd been building sort of like web apps around that, but not necessarily the same level of like enterprise complexity and things. I think part of it is how the system's resourced as well, like the necessity. It's a different world to buying something off the shelf that's kind of largely done and then building something from scratch. And when you build from scratch, you come at it differently because you're having to prioritize the capacity you've got to feed the build you need to do. So we had a bunch of stuff from the original kind of like Bootstrap implementations and things like that. So we had some standard components and things, but we didn't have a lot of rules. As we started to try and customize those things more, like the team would focus on building new componentry, but it was kind of like more of an as needed basis. And then that's when you kind of like have to make decisions, I think, around how you resource the design systems team versus other engineering concerns. Like, do you resource them enough that they can build and supply and enable the entire team, the entire company, or are you trying to sort of like I don't know, I guess balance that out to get just enough for what you need to keep sort of moving forwards. I don't think it's an easy one to get right, but the challenge is when you're doing a bit as you go, it's like fixing user experience a bit as you go. You're designing in small, discrete increments, and then you need that point where you take a step back and you refactor and you rethink, and it's really hard to do that in that sort of growth, I guess. I mean, I think ultimately it's a really hard problem because there's no like perfect state for a web app. There's a lot of stuff that is like very, I guess, oh god, sorry. I think like we talk about like we see like transformational redesigns of apps, and we talk about like bringing in new design systems and stuff. But the thing is that you're never at an end state. It's always changing. Like either the needs of the app, the functional needs, the scope, and the experience need to change along with it. And even just like at a visual level, trends are just constantly changing. So something that was just visually cool a while ago, just like what looks good will change. And so you need at the very least to be able to like theme the components you have, and then the interaction patterns will all still change in a way that's not always predictable. Like AI, like the idea that we're getting this kind of agentic kind of interactions, even over these kinds of like different kinds of interactions that we thought was sort of the way the future was going. So it's always a moving target, which makes it really hard to plan for the future.
I was going to ask, like, as you evolved the design system in early days, what was the adoption like? Was it easy to get engineers on side, having them understand, and then as you grew, have everyone else on board with the design system? Like, was there much of a selling of the benefits of it, or was it kind of adopted as a company pretty easily?
I think it was a spiky kind of process. It's a challenge we still face in terms of, I think you made a really good point about the like return on investment or the value. Like there's a certain effort involved in buying into the design system. And if the effort of doing that is low, then people will use it. And if it's high, they'll build bespoke stuff. And the challenge you have is like, if the design system can't meet your, so if your design system can't meet your needs, or it's expensive to use it, with either that's because it's not flexible, or it doesn't make it easy to vary as like things evolve, then you start ending up with like snowflakes and things. And each individual decision is like a really rational prioritization decision at the time, but then you end up with 100 snowflakes that are really hard to change later. So you're building in debt as a part of that. And so, it's a genuinely like tricky problem. Like the bootstrapping problem is a generally tricky one. If you have something to start with that is well enabled, then I think that can help, but it's not always easy to start with that. And at least it wasn't at the time, because there weren't a lot of really good systems around. And like systems that exist at the time couldn't service now because accessibility wasn't baked in. We're like, I don't know, 5 versions deep into Bootstrap, and there's much better systems around now too. We're using React for a lot of things, and so you always kind of sort of making the best trade-offs you can at a given point in time, and just trying to keep an eye on the future, I think.
What was the like, who's responsible for the governance of, I guess, ensuring people are using it and there's not 100 snowflakes at the end of a process? Like who's controlling it internally?
So there's always 2 aspects we talk about design systems too. There's the build engineering side, and there's the design side. It can be tricky enough keeping those in alignment, let alone also doing the governance. So like all the engineering governance goes through like engineering practice. They have like engineering standards and things like that. So it's part of whether it work, how it's previewed and approved. But they still make compromises to meet delivery. And I suppose design is the same. This is that, I guess, that factor of scale coming in again. Like when it's just one designer, you can make sure you use the design system for everything. You can make sure everything stays consistent in its application. When you have 2, it's a slightly harder conversation, but you immediately realize you've got problems because you don't agree on something. And unless you have, like, as you say, governance, one who breaks when there's disagreement, then you can't move forward. we had that in sort of the role of the design director who was ultimately accountable for the design system. So they became part of the process in terms of like working with designers to try and increase consistency, coherency, adoption of the system, um, helped raise awareness of new patterns that were emerging and things like that, and tried to sort of generally skew towards a more coherent world. But it's not. It has its challenges too, because like he became a single point of failure. So there's a capacity problem, and there's also like if that person's making bad choices, then you've got a problem. So I think processes over people in that instance, if you can. And that's about like sort of building your knowledge and your guidance and the way you do that over time to have enough of a robust system that decisions are easier to make. Like the easiest, you can at least try and take a lot of the really easy stuff off the table. But it's a generally hard problem. You need more people to service more designers, but then the more people you have without that overarching kind of like, I don't know, rule set to apply. I've seen it. Like we had, as the team grew, we already had like, no matter what you put in place, you have differences between the people working with the product designers over the compromises that you make. And even then, like specific patterns can change, like the popularity or the interest in specific kinds of patterns can change over time as well.
Quicker now than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something to like, you don't want to be necessarily overly restrictive because that creates its own problems. That we sort of had some design system components where we tried to control at a component level how they were used to enforce the rules, but that meant they couldn't adapt when you needed to make contextual variations, and which meant people didn't use them because it was too hard to submit a change or get one approved or done or something like that. I think like your system and the rules and guidelines that come with it, they're ideally they're sensible defaults and they're the start of the conversation, but they're not the end of it.
Yeah. I love this conversation. Like we do quite a lot of design system work as a consultancy. So a lot of our clients are enterprise. So they have design systems or they need design systems. So that's what we do a lot. And I think it's a bit of an underserviced market when you take that back to scale ups or SMEs. A lot of people maybe don't necessarily understand what a design system is yet. And they have a lot of inconsistencies across their product. Given your experience going from startup, scale up, through to where you are now, if you were to go in to let's say a scale up or an SME now, like what would be the sort of the starting point that you'd try and build with the design system? Like you've obviously had lessons learned and some probably battles along the way. Like what would you start to get as a bare minimum to get the consistency across design, engineering, and the product?
Yeah, I mean, if I was starting from scratch, I think I'd honestly now start with something off the shelf. I'd want a bootstrapped system that I could start with and start building compositions and more higher order patterns out of. I think I'd be very important that it was themable and it was implemented in a way that it was easy to make changes. So we're sort of reducing the cost of change later. So I definitely want to be focusing more on those higher order patterns, the ones that can be tricky to change later. So, grid systems, page layouts, sort of like that sort of guideline level around how you compose the ecosystem of your app. More so than like, individual custom componentry and stuff. Done a lot of freelance stuff over the years as well. I have a friend who builds sort of workflow apps for small businesses. And yeah, you definitely find like there's a lot of value. The value in over customizing or over indexing on very custom componentry over just using good compositions. You quickly get to sort of diminishing returns.
Can you oversimplify it as well? Because like a lot of people think they might have a design system, whereas it's not actually highly functional. No one actually uses it. There's no governance to it. Like, is there also the opposite side where it's not It was half baked.
I think that's the most common state. Even if you don't start that way, you eventually get there because it changes. Like when you design a design system for an existing product, it's based on the way the product currently works. And so you do like a gathering and analysis and a synthesis of all of the needs, and then you distill that into, the smallest number of like atoms, I guess, that you and molecules that you need to sort of deliver it out. And they're all consistent and it's great. And then over time that all changes. And so over time, everything sort of skews towards chaos, I guess. And I think there's still value in the system, even if it's not perfect. If they're, like I said, like sensible defaults are always better than having none. It reduces the effort involved in designing your experiences. It means that you have more sensible starting points. But I do think it's an unsolved problem how you keep that efficiency you have when you start and sort of maintain that along the way as things sort of fragment and change.
You mentioned earlier that if you've got one designer, it's easy. If you've got two designers, it starts to get like a bit more challenging because there's other people. Like a lot of the conversations that I have with maybe smaller businesses, they might only have one designer, and this designer might be, let's say, a senior designer, not a head of design, hasn't, I guess, grown in design practice in the past, and they feel like they've got a design system. They kind of become a roadblock to a degree in that sense. Like, how do you overcome that as a business if you've got someone there that has kind of put together something, but it's not necessarily helping the engineers or keep consistency?
So in what way would they be, like, can you give me a bit more detail on how they would be a roadblock?
Well, maybe they're just like, they've half-assed something, so they think it's a design system. All they've got is a couple of Figma files, and it's not really adding value to anyone other than how they approach their job. So it's not actually working with the engineers to ensure that their components are working the same as the design components.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, like the way you fix it at a system level is you need to have a good cross-functional ecosystem. I think that underlies everything. If there's one designer or 100, they need to be working closely with whatever the proxy is for product and with engineering. Like the smaller your feedback loops are, the better. You have like feasibility and effort as always needs to be factored into design. I think in like there was a world where design was a more we like spoke to Agile, but it was a very waterfall process in terms of like we do the diamond and do the other diamond, and then here you go, here's your designs. And the way the teams build to learn quickly, especially when you're experimenting, is they need to be like, yeah, they're diamonds, but they're much smaller and there's more of them, and you need to be doing stuff as you go. So I think like the only answer to that is to have that empathy cross-functionally so that people are working in a way that improves. I think like that was my biggest thing that most impressed me for a long time at Cultute was these cross-functional teams. We put a lot of effort into making all of those continuous improvement practices that engineers were already good at, cross-functional practices in the teams, making space for product and design to be involved in that continuous process and having a loud enough voice so they could drive it. And I think that's a big part of it, like that ability to constantly adapt.
Look, let's stick with that for the final comment. Constantly adapting. Like I've watched Culture Amp scale from, I think, before you joined to where they are now, and it's been obviously inspiring to watch, but you've been there for the whole journey. What's the best thing, I guess, for you as a designer or an individual as your career that's, I guess, come from being there for the whole journey?
So, I mean, the best thing, it might sound trite, but it's the people I've gone to work with along the way. Like I've been there long enough that I've gone to work along the spectrum of my own growth with a bunch of really incredible people that have been they've been amazing to work with. They've really built a lot of empathy for other practices, and I've just learned so much from all those people that I wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise, which was absolutely amazing. And I guess you combine that with the fact that going through over the lifetime of a startup from that size of like less than 20 people to where it is now, it's an enormous opportunity for growth, because you have to kind of keep up with the pace of the business's scale. And so, the kinds you often hear, like the kinds of people you need when you start your business aren't always the bit we need at the end. And it's an opportunity for you to sort of be able to grow and adapt to sort of meet that moment.
Well, good on you for keeping up with that pace because, yeah, like, I guess working in a 20-man business is very different to a 1,000-person business. And for you to be able to evolve as quick as the business evolves, obviously kudos to you for learning and growing at that pace. Kudos to the founders because they're still hands-on, aren't they? They're still involved in the business.
Yeah, don't get
Dave, it was an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. So thank you so much for jumping on the podcast. If anyone wants to reach out to you, what's the best way? Just hit you up on LinkedIn?
Yeah, that's probably the easiest.
Nice one. Well, once again, thanks so much for jumping on. It was a pleasure to unpack your journey with Cultute.
Yeah, great chat. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. Now, if you loved today's episode, please make sure you subscribe. Also, leave us a like and a comment. It helps people like yourself find this video, so it makes a world of difference.